My name's Carlton Ward Jr., and I'm a conservation photographer.
Hello, I'm John Rossi. I'm a touring drummer with a passion for animal conservation. When I'm on the road, I spend as much time as possible visiting zoos, aquariums, and conservation organizations. Now, I want to share those places with you. I'll be talking to keepers, vets, conservationists, anyone who can help me in my mission of connecting my people to animals through their people. Join me on my Rossifari. Hello, and welcome back to the Rossifari podcast. Y'all, we've got a really cool episode this week with a different guest, somebody who you can actually see on Disney Plus right now. And no, I'm not talking about Luke Skywalker or Thor, although, you know, this is a person who is a hero in a very different way. My guest today is wildlife photographer Carlton Ward Jr. And this is a person who has just done some really amazing stuff to help the native wildlife in Florida. There's this whole concept of the Florida Wildlife Corridor that you're going to learn about. And there's also a new book coming out about some of these efforts, as well as a documentary that's now available on Hulu and on Disney Plus called Path of the Panther. And the day that it dropped, I pulled up Disney Plus and instantly turned that film on. This is an important story. It is an incredible conversation about what it takes to really help save a species that is wildly important. I'm excited to share this one with y'all. I really am. So real quick, before we get to that, I just want to remind you all to make sure you hit subscribe and make sure that you're following along at Rossifari on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and at Rossifari Pod on TikTok. And if you'd like to support the pod, don't forget that you can go to patreon.com/Rossifari and support the pod for as little as $3 a month. All right, let's get to this interview with Nat Geo Explorer, author, filmmaker, conservationist, and wildlife photographer Carlton Ward Jr. I got an email, I guess from your publicist or whatever, asking if I'd be interested in having you on the podcast and talking about your book and everything. And I had just seen your name a couple days before that because a friend of mine who is a zookeeper in Florida attended a film showing that you then spoke at. And she put up this big post talking about how awesome you were and how everybody needed to check you out. And then like a couple days later, I get an email saying, hey, you want to have this guy on your podcast? And I was like, yes, I do. And I immediately wrote to Alicia, my friend, and was like, guess what? I'm going to be talking to that dude.
I was zookeeper friend approved, so that's good.
I'm always excited, like at how small the conservation world is. You know what I mean? I thought that was so funny that your name just popped on up. So, yeah. So let's dig into who you are a little bit. And then we're going to get to panthers and Florida wildlife and all that stuff. But I'm curious, like how you got your start and your passion for all of this.
Well, we could spend the whole hour on this topic. So I'll see if there's a kind of a Cliff Notes version, but I grew up in Clearwater, Florida, on the Gulf Coast in suburban town. I don't know if you know that part of the state, but Pinellas County is the most densely populated county in the eastern United States.
Wow.
So I grew up on one hand in an area that had very little green space left, but I also have a cattle ranch in the family that's in the interior part of the state and lots of cousins who are full-time cowboys. So I kind of was straddling these two different Floridas my whole upbringing. I fell in love with nature through experiences like snorkeling in the seagrasses with the Clearwater Marine Science Center, or camping out with the Boy Scouts, or hunting and exploring the woods with my family on our ranch. And so I kind of didn't really label myself or understand myself to be a conservationist until college, when I went away to North Carolina for school and studied biology and anthropology and started really understanding the plight of people on this planet and the trajectory of our development, and starting to see everything that we had taken for granted living in the urban cores and on the coast, and how disconnected we have been from the natural world. And as I studied science, as I learned about the biodiversity crisis and the loss of languages and the assimilation of cultures and all this evaporation of kind of ecological heritage and indigenous knowledge, and at the same time, like a big disconnect that is even happening with so much of the world, as my kind of understandings in science grew, and I picked up a camera for the first time in college and started documenting my experience, like those two worlds, I've been trying to combine them ever since. And I started to see, even in the early parts of my career, how useful photography and storytelling was to help bridge some of those gaps between what the scientific world has known for decades and what the leaders of our country, the leaders of our states, the average citizen is walking around with in their head. So that's been the niche I've been serving to serve my whole career.
That's very cool. That's it's something that took me a long time to come to an understanding of myself. Getting into the conservation education side of things has been a later development for me with this podcast and with photography before that. But it's the same thing. I've come to realize how important storytelling, both, writing and doing audio stuff like podcasts, and photography is, and what an impact it can have on the world of conservation science. So that's very cool to hear, and very inspiring to me as somebody who is starting off, on that path here in the last couple of years. I think it's really interesting that you come from that area of Florida where you see the dichotomy of the two different areas. I spend a lot of time gigging in Florida. I'm a professional musician, and I just
I thought you were hunting for frogs with a trident shaped spear, which I know a lot of people who also do.
See, that's amazing to me. And every time I'm in Florida, that's the thing. Like, I was just playing in Fort Myers, and I've played in Naples, and every time I'm going through that state, I have that same experience of I'm playing for 5,000 people a night, and then on my day off in the Everglades and not seeing a human, and, having alligators literally float right by and everything. And I've always found it to be such a fascinating place. It's cool that inspired your entire career.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I didn't even know it was inspiring my career early on, but it definitely forged my view on everything. And it's, as you know, as someone who's been here, Florida, we could say, is topographically challenged. We don't have elevation, or once you are adapted, the 300-foot rise of the Lake Wales Ridge, pops your ears. But it's part of the reason that these amazing wild places at the heart of our state remain hidden in plain sight to so many of Florida's 22 million residents and 130 million annual visitors, because you have to purposefully go out into these wild places or fly over them in order to even understand that they're there. If you're sitting in Denver, you might never leave the urban core, but on a clear day, you can see the Rocky Mountains, and you understand that they have intrinsic value. You can associate them with your sources of water, where the wildlife live, maybe where your clean air is generated. We have that same relationship to nature in Florida, but we just can't see it unless we go seeking for it. Right. If we're able to successfully connect people to those places with stories.
Very cool. And so one way that you're doing that is through a new book, Path of the Panther, New Hope for Wild Florida. And, one thing that stood out to me immediately about that is the fact that you have the word hope in the title. And I feel like sometimes when we talk about conservation stuff, it's easy to lose sight of the hope. So tell me about the book and what inspired you not only to write it, but to come at it from that perspective.
When I gave my gave my title in the beginning of the talk as a conservation photographer, that might sound limiting, but that is also like the highest level aspiration and title I have, because what that means is that I hope that my photography will inspire conservation. My role models as storytellers and photographers, going back to William Henry Jackson and Ansel Adams, who inspired some of the earliest national parks, to like a modern day hero of Michael Nick Nichols at National Geographic, whose work with the Wildlife Conservation Society helped inspire 13 national parks in Gabon in the early 2000s. There's conservation is the goal. Photography is a powerful tool to help us get there. Never in isolation, always with lots of partners. But, the hope is baked in to my approach because it's an intention to try to inspire the protection of the things that I'm focusing on. The Path of the Panther project is the most recent chapter in a 15-year-long project I've been leading called the Florida Wildlife Corridor. I had gotten my early career started in working in Africa. I had amazing opportunities with the Smithsonian in Gabon, in the rainforest of Central Africa, and then later in the deserts of Mali with the migratory desert elephant population. But over those 4 or 5 years where I was spending more time in Africa than I was at home, every time I flew home, there was a new subdivision on what used to be a cattle ranch or native land. And I started to feel this kind of building pressure to train my lens on places closer to where I grew up and where I had like an authentic voice. And so that started by looking at cattle ranches, because it's this hidden in plain sight realm of Florida, 6 million acres of land at the time, a fifth of the state by land mass, and arguably the most pivotal landscape in the state. It's either going to be green into the future or it's going to be developed. And there's really two lanes to choose from there. And I'm not giving you a quick answer on the Path of the Panther part, but
I don't need quick answers. I love going deep with people, and people will be inspired by what you're saying. Please go. We're here to talk to people who want to learn about conservation. So do the thing. Got it.
Okay. So so I've been working on cattle ranches, trying to raise awareness for that part of Florida's hidden heritage. I published a book in 2009 called Florida Cowboys, Keepers of the Last Frontier. And, that had that hopeful theme of how these lands are saving the best of what's left of Florida, and with a perspective that we can try to keep it that way. Through the process of working on that book, I met some bear biologists who were putting GPS collars on black bears that were living almost entirely on cattle ranches in South Central Florida. And, I thought I was pretty well connected to Florida. I'm an 8th generation Floridian. I've spent a lot of time in these places. I didn't know we had black bears living almost entirely on private ranch lands in a relatively isolated population in that part of the state. And so those bears became like a window into the story of connected landscapes. And my colleague, Joe Guthrie, then working with Archbold Biological Station and University of Kentucky, with his professor, David Mayer, were gathering really interesting information from these GPS collars. One of the bears they collared in 2009, later in 2010, walked 500 miles in 2 months.
Wow.
And the dots on the map showed you what you could potentially infer from looking at a satellite image is kind of what's green is connected. And the bear traveled across public land, but much of his journey was across open rangelands and citrus groves and timber forests. And it just empirically showed that this whole region of the greater Everglades, from Orlando south to Fort Myers, was connected from the perspective of a wandering black bear. It also showed the challenges, because the bear got as far north as Orlando, presumably he could sense the 500,000 acres of the green swamp wilderness to the north, but had a barrier in between, which happens to be Interstate 4.
Right.
And skirted the edge of that interstate, presumably couldn't find a safe place to cross, and actually journeyed further back south and dropped his GPS collar a lot closer to where he was born. And so, that bear and other bears from that study opened my eyes to the bigger story, that these ranch lands were one piece of a bigger fabric. And as I went deeper with the scientists, as I learned about the state of the research for connected landscapes, there was something called the Florida Ecological Greenways Network. And this was legacy of scientists from the University of Florida, currently led by Tom Hochter and some other conservation groups active there, that had mapped out how you could best connect up all the green patches in the state of Florida. And for people who aren't familiar with natural Florida, the state's about 36 million acres of upland, or it's 42 million acres, but there's a lot of inland water. But the state of Florida is about 36 million acres. And within that, we have 10 million acres of permanently protected public land. It's a huge conservation legacy, especially for a state in the East. It's, a little more than 25% of our state is protected.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so we have these stepping stones for the Florida Wildlife Corridor that's already in place. But this is before I started the Florida Wildlife Corridor Storytelling Project. And what we had was these 10 million acres of protected lands. The Florida Ecological Greenways Network, which was a science of how to connect them, but no unifying story that could bring the public and the decision makers into the solutions. And so that's where the Florida Wildlife Corridor idea was born. I learned about the bears. I learned about the amazing research that was happening. And at the same time, I saw that research was not informing public decisions. And evidence of that was also in the year 2006, a new toll road was proposed called the Heartland Parkway. And this road would have cut a new highway straight into Florida's wildest places from Orlando down towards Naples. And the fact that this was going to change the face of ranch country and introduce whole new sets of challenges for those bears that my buddy Joe was studying, that wasn't acceptable to me. So I got together with the scientists and proposed that we call the Ecological Greenways Network something that people in the public might better connect with. So that's where the Florida Wildlife Corridor idea was born. It was workshopped with the Nature Conservancy in Audubon, Defenders of Wildlife, Archibald Biological Station, some of the state agencies, and everyone gave approval for this kind of storytelling campaign that we were beginning. And that's been the focus of my career for the past 15 years, kind of modeling some of the role models. That sounds funny to say modeling role models, but, following in the footsteps of some of my conservation heroes, like Nick Nichols and Mike Fay. They had walked nearly 2,000 miles on an expedition across Africa in the process of inspiring those new national parks. I teamed up with the bear biologist Joe Guthrie, a fellow conservationist, then at the Nature Conservancy, Mallory Likes-Demet, and we did a 1,000-mile expedition from the Everglades to Georgia in 2012 to show that Florida still had a connected wildlife corridor. So this was our effort to try to put the concept of the Florida Wildlife Corridor on the map. And it's been an extended process. We publish books and films and have been doing awareness and stakeholder work for the past 10 years, including another 1,000-mile expedition in 2015 that went from the headwaters of the Everglades near Orlando around the Gulf Coast, Alabama.
Nice. That's really cool.
So we'd kind of shown by literally hiking, paddling, and biking 2,000 miles the way that a bear or panther could still travel through our state. So that expedition wrapped up in 2015. I went to my editor at National Geographic, Kathy Moran, who's a legend of a natural history photo editor there, and said, I want to do a story about the Florida Wildlife Corridor. That was my whole orientation on the world. And she said, well, National Geographic right now is probably not going to do a story just on a wildlife corridor, but we would look at the story of the Florida panther and use it as an emblem in a way into the bigger story.
Right.
And so I kind of joke about it, but that 15-minute conversation sent me on a 6-year-long quest. And I wrote a grant application in 2015 for the Path of the Panther project, received a couple additional grants from the National Geographic Society, during those years and began a storytelling campaign around the Florida panther to ultimately take the Florida Wildlife Corridor idea to the next level of reach and impact. And so, I mean, this is all answering that new hope for wild Florida. Like, I saw the Florida Wildlife Corridor as the hope, or, I saw the cowboy and the rancher as the hope. I saw the black bear as the hope. I saw the wildlife corridor as a hope. And more recently, I saw the Florida panther as the ultimate symbol of what we could still accomplish together in Florida for land conservation. I had no idea. This tends to be a theme. I think when I first raised my hand naively at a bear workshop in 2009 and said, let's call this thing the Florida Wildlife Corridor so people will know what we're talking about, I didn't know that, dozen years later, 2,000 miles of expeditions, I'd still be doing that same thing. By the same token, when I went and set my first camera traps in Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge, started the Path of the Panther project, not really having an idea that was going to take literally 5 years of work to get the pictures I needed for a National Geographic story. But it's amazing how these journeys unfold, because as I was struggling in the first couple of years to even get one or two usable frames that could hold the Florida panther shoulder to shoulder with lions and leopards and tigers and all the other animals we've been inundated with imagery from, new threats were emerging as well as new hope. So let me give you a little more background of why the Florida panther is such a good emblem of the Florida Wildlife Corridor.
Great.
The Florida panther is the last puma, the last big cat surviving east of the Mississippi River. The numbers had dwindled down to fewer than 20 panthers as recently as the 1970s and 80s. And they were one of the first species that was afforded protections by the Endangered Species Act, which is celebrating its 50th year this year. So in that time, it kind of went from a persecuted species to a conservation species. But there have been lots of conflict with settlers, early pioneer Americans, and panthers for decades or even centuries. They were basically hunted out of existence, persecuted, and pushed out by habitat loss, so the only remnant population of pumas east of the Mississippi River was in a really remote corner of the Everglades at the southern tip of Florida. And it's because that, in my opinion, is the last wildest place where settlers didn't necessarily even want to be.
Right, right.
And I don't think it's any coincidence that the Seminole and Miccosukee people, who are said to be America's only unconquered tribe, also survived 3 wars against U.S. generals during the same time period, sharing that same wild and remote land near the southern tip of Florida. And it's from those swamps deep in the Everglades, out of reach from most of the needs of early development, that the Florida panther has staged its comeback story. And it's gone from the brink of extinction with fewer than 20 to nearly 200 panthers today. It's become the state animal of Florida, voted by school children, I think, in the 1990s. There's a hockey team named after it who won a miraculous Game 7 win in the playoffs last night.
Yeah, they did.
It's got a lot of cultural, it has cultural identity and value in Florida, even if people don't necessarily connect it yet to the land that it represents. And so that's been a big part of my goal with the project, to really tell the story of the Florida panther in depth with beautiful imagery in a comprehensive way for the first time, so that people would understand what this animal is and also what it represents for the future of our state. And so there's been a lot of hope. We have rebound from 20 to 200, but in order to be off the endangered species list, the species recovery plan is asking for nearly 700 panthers. So you need to have a tripling of the population. And the only way that's going to happen is having access to 3 times as much land, because panthers need a lot of land. That's one of the other reasons they're a great icon of the Florida Wildlife Corridor. One male Florida panther has a home range need of 200 square miles. So that's 4 times the size of Miami or twice the size of Orlando in geographic area.
Wow.
And the only way that's going to happen outside of the big public lands of South Florida is to have multiple adjacent properties working together as one connected habitat. And the only way they're going to reach sustainable numbers throughout Florida and beyond is having access to more of their historic territory further north in the peninsula, all the way up to the Florida Panhandle in the southeastern United States. So the measure of that recovery, the measure of that success was that there had been no female panthers documented north of Fort Myers, Florida since 1973. Male panthers with that bigger home range had been wandering the peninsula for decades. In fact, there was a male panther shot by a hunter in North Georgia 11 years ago that was traced back to being born in the Ocalacuchee Slough State Forest in the southern tip of Florida. And so, male panthers have been traveling and dispersing even out of the state of Florida. But until 2016, there would be no female panther to find anywhere north of Fort Myers. So the big moment was when scientists from our State Fish and Wildlife Commission got tracks and photo evidence of the first female panther north of the Caloosahatchee River in 43 years. And I was in the first year of the Path of the Panther project working towards a story for National Geographic magazine, and they thankfully allowed me to relocate some of my camera traps and some of my storytelling effort in partnership with them. And so in January of 2017, I got a picture on one of my camera traps of this beautiful female panther walking by the camera, and I shared it to the head panther biologist from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, David Schindel, and he said back to me, Carlton, I've been dreaming about that panther for 18 years. Because for his whole career, that is the stepping stone. That's the symbol of success, the emblem of hope, the female reclaiming new territory in the Northern Everglades. And he knew enough to look at the picture to see that she was lactating and in nursing condition. So there's a Florida panther kitten somewhere in her world. And so that became the focus of my work, the focus of the storytelling. That's when we began the Path of the Panther film, which is coming out to Disney Plus very soon on May 5th. David Schindel told me he'd been dreaming about this panther for 18 years, which is really touching, made me feel like my work was making a difference to the people who are out there actually saving these wildlife. I also shared that picture with a multi-generational cattle rancher named Kerry Lightsey, he and his family have several ranches in the Northern Everglades, which is the same region where this female panther was starting to make her new home. So I called Kerry and said, what do you think about this female panther coming back to the Northern Everglades near your ranches? And I'll never forget what he said. I was servicing a camera trap in Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge. My phone was sitting on speakerphone on a log in the swamp, and he had just called me back, and he said, Carlton, the panther is going to have to help us save Florida, because it's going to show all the people why we need to save these last large connected spaces. And to hear that from him, to hear that from the perspective of the panther biologist and from the generational rancher, that the panther was going to be part of the solution, gave me new hope, gave me new motivation to keep pushing with the story.
Yeah, that's really exciting.
Yeah, that was the moment where it just clarified the story,
right?
And so that is the story. I mean, and if you look at the book, Kerry Lightsey has an essay in the book where he talks about ranchers and panthers living together, and he talks about the fact that ranchers and panthers in a state like Florida, where 1,000 people are moving here every day, ranchers and panthers are both endangered species. And I think that is a really on one hand, daunting perspective, but also a really hopeful perspective, because if Floridians can continue to rally around the call and the cause of saving land for the Florida panther, doing that also helps save a future for cattle ranching and other types of agricultural land uses that are still happening in this state. So the ranchers are saving the land for the panthers, but the panthers could ultimately help save a future for ranching, because they're going to be the catalyst to get the public attention and to get the public dollars. And that's just not theoretical, because in April of 2021, when my first features length story was published in National Geographic magazine about the Florida panther, the Florida legislature was also considering a new law called the Florida Wildlife Corridor Act, where we had worked with conservation partners to successfully request and introduce this idea of recognizing the Florida Wildlife Corridor in state law. And through the leadership of state senators and state representatives, and eventually the governor, the Florida Wildlife Corridor Act passed with unanimous bipartisan support.
Okay, how? Can I honestly, how did first of all, how does anything pass with bipartisan support nowadays? But how were you able to convince so many people, especially in a state where, I would say that the average American would think that the politics of Florida would not lean towards the conservation side? And maybe that's just wrong, but how did you pull that off? That's incredible.
I think it's the power of the story and the power of the panther to help unify the land and unify people around saving the land. It's not just about the panther. I mean, the panther is a symbol for the future of agriculture, the future of fresh water, the future of high quality water moving into our estuaries. It's all of this green space, but by being able to distribute a copy of that National Geographic magazine to every state lawmaker, to be able to do slideshows, to be able to screen a different film we had made called Saving the Florida Wildlife Corridor, it helped bring people together around the story. But I will also add that conservation has been a bipartisan issue in Florida for most of my memory.
That's actually wonderful to hear.
Yeah, I mean, one of our most successful land conservation programs, now called Florida Forever, was originally created as Preservation 2000 by Republican Governor Bob Martinez. It was sustained and strengthened by Jeb Bush. It was sustained by Governor Charlie Crist, who was at that point a Republican. So we had a great legacy of land conservation. But I think that over time, in the years since the recession of 2008, that land conservation started to get polarized. That's when the Tea Party was born. That's when politics started to become a little more divisive. And some of our most unifying ideas, like the Florida Forever program, like saving land for all Floridians, started to get a little bit divided. And then there was a constitutional amendment in 2014 where voters were upset that money wasn't being spent for land conservation like it had in previous administrations. This was during Rick Scott's administration, largely driven by the fact that we were coming out of the Great Recession. But the land conservation dollars never went back to the pre-recession levels. The voters of Florida voted with a 75% majority to spend lots more money on land conservation. But the nature of the constitutional amendment that year was written broadly enough that it included things like land management. And that gave a loophole where the legislature was able to spend that money for lots of things other than just buying and protecting land or buying and paying for conservation easements. And so that's when things started getting polarized, because you had environmental groups suing the legislature for not honoring the will of the voters and their opinion, and the legislators, well, we're doing what the law told us to do. And I think people lost sight of the common goal, because when you do have a state that is 26, 27% public land, it's not it's not unreasonable to look at a balance sheet and say, that's a lot of public land. Why do we need more public land?
Right.
Why don't we keep it on the tax roll to help support these local counties? But when you bring that together into a story like the Florida Wildlife Corridor, and you show that, look at all these amazing public lands, and look what happens if we inadvertently put an incompatible development right between this national park and that state forest. It's a common sense solution, no matter what your background is, that land use connecting those two places is probably better to be in a green state. Some sort of conservation, either in a new public land or an easement on a cattle ranch or a citrus grove. And so, that story had been lost. And so through the Path of the Panther project, through the ongoing work with the Florida Wildlife Corridor, we were able to help make Florida's conservation story more accessible to more people. And that would be, I guess, our contribution, which is certainly just one piece of the puzzle. I think another big driving factor was that in 2019, there was another new toll road proposed. And that toll road, just like in 2006, there were 3 toll roads proposed in 2019. One of those toll roads would have, again, gone from Orlando to Naples. And this time, it wasn't just the bear habitat that people were thinking about. It was also the territory where that first female panther in my lifetime was setting up her new home range. But the big difference between 2006 and 2019 is that the Florida Wildlife Corridor was very much a part of the conversation, at least within the environmental community and the planning groups. There were maps, the idea was there. And we published just another story in National Geographic at that time that started to show that this was a big issue that the world was watching. And for me, it was a tipping point in the motivation to try to pursue legislation to protect the wildlife corridor. Because my team at the Path of the Panther Project and our storytelling organization, Wild Path, have been pushing that story. But we'd been working alongside colleagues at the Florida Wildlife Corridor Foundation, a new organization called Live Wildly, and lots of other partners. Our early work had been awareness. We've been trying to create awareness for the wildlife corridor.
Right.
What I realized in 2019 is awareness alone wasn't enough, because here was a new version of the toll road that inspired the whole effort in me, a dozen years before. And if there was any chance for the Florida Wildlife Corridor to actually endure, to actually be protected, throughout my lifetime and for my children, it was going to take some sort of legal recognition that this was a priority for the state of Florida. And I actually learned a lot from the toll road process, because that's an infrastructure proposal. And it's an infrastructure designed to serve the needs of Florida's residents. And it was proposed, there was lots of money put out for a series of public hearings. There was going to be multiple years of a planning process to envision and consider how and where a road should be built. And I was envious of that in a way. Wouldn't it be amazing if planning for conservation and green space got the same amount of attention, the same amount of resource, the same amount of public brainpower to think about how to do this for the long term?
Right.
When you're building a road, you have to take a 10-year view of it, and you have to work with every landowner along the way, and you have to coordinate it, and you have to scope it. Green infrastructure, natural infrastructure, should be no different. We should be looking at what does it take to save these connected green spaces that are the foundation for everything. And instead, we'd had a pattern of just fighting for scraps in that conversation. And so those toll roads kind of set up a good analogy and a good premise for the Florida Wildlife Corridor Act, to say that we need to balance development and ecosystems in the state of Florida, and the natural ecosystem needs a framework or an identity that's just as real in people's mind as a new road. So you can actually put an image on it and think about what it's going to do, what it's going to connect, and how it's going to serve Floridians today and into the future. So that's giving a lot of detail, but that's kind of the backstory and the tapestry and the foundation of everything that's going on throughout the arc of the Path of the Panther project. And it was, absolutely the highlight of my career and the fulfillment of like my whole life's mission to have the Florida Wildlife Corridor Act passed unanimously in 2021. And I'm even more excited to report that state leaders on their own initiative decided to invest $400 million of funding into conservation easements and land acquisitions that first year, $450 million in land acquisitions and conservation easements in 2022. And there's nearly $1 billion of land acquisition and conservation funding being considered in this year's legislative session.
That's amazing.
It's phenomenal. It's on pace with what was happening in the 1990s and early 2000s, where the state of Florida was saving 15,000 acres a month through land conservation programs. And we're getting back to that place. Live Wildly and the Florida Wildlife Corridor Foundation commissioned a study after 2021 with McKinsey, which was an economic report of the Florida Wildlife Corridor. It did a lot of things that quantified the economic value, like the 6x return on land conservation investments, the $30 or $40 billion annual economic impact the corridor provides. It also put a focus on how fast we're going to lose it if we don't do something. And so there's a projection that we're going to lose 500,000 acres of habitat by the end of this decade. And it sets up a need to save approximately, we're going to lose 500,000 acres of habitat without being proactive on more land conservation, without saving the corridor. And it set up a goal of saving 900,000 acres by the end of 2030. And so in order to do that, the state of Florida needs to be saving about 10,000 acres a month.
Wow.
To keep up with the pace of development. Because we have 1,000 people a day still moving here. And the pattern of that development is still sprawl. So it's pushing further and further from urban cores. What saving the Florida Wildlife Corridor can do is protect the most sensitive, highest priority landscapes and effectively steer new development closer to cities, closer to urban areas, and set up this more sustainable balance that I think everybody here wants. You can tell I get into the details on this stuff, but that
yeah, you do. But I think that's important. I don't think most people even begin to comprehend how much goes into a project like this. I mean, that's incredible.
So there was a huge moment in 2021 with the legislation, and in the ensuing couple of years, the Florida Wildlife Corridor has gone from an idea that was being shepherded by a small number of organizations and storytellers to an officially recognized geography that belongs to all Floridians. And so we're at an exciting point in this movement where it's become a framework and a language where state leaders and landowners and people from the business community and the conservation community are starting to embrace it as an identity and a tool for Florida. My hope and intention for the Path of the Panther book and the new Path of the Panther film is that we're able to tell this story now on a world stage through National Geographic and Disney Plus, and help feed the enthusiasm and the motivation to keep going in Florida, because we have a long way to go. We've had some amazing success these past 3 years. We've got to keep going with land conservation through the end of the decade and beyond in order to achieve this balance. But it's a beautiful balance, and that's where my hope comes from. And I also think it's a model that if we can accomplish this in Florida, in a state that people don't think is, politically cohesive, or in a state that has so much development, we can accomplish this sort of balance anywhere. The pressures here are intense. The peninsula is only 120 miles wide. A few short-sighted land use decisions can literally cut the state of Florida in half in any number of given places. But at the same time, we have the hope and we've shown that we have the will to do the right things to save this place for the future. And that's where the hope comes from.
And that's the thing that you said that gives me the most hope, because I constantly surround myself with conservation stories. That's a big part of what I do. And there's hope and there's challenge in all of them. But the place that I've never really heard much hope before is the political arena. And especially like you said, Florida, is a very, it's a hotbed of a movement that maybe you wouldn't expect would be promoting this, but y'all have done such amazing storytelling that you've given me hope with politicians, and that's next level. When does the film come out?
The film's out on Hulu now, and it launches on Disney Plus on May 5th.
May 5th. Okay, cool. Yeah, I have Disney Plus. I'm excited.
We're really excited about that. Yeah, that's going to be a big moment for us, because it's my purpose throughout all of this is to help give the Florida Wildlife Corridor the attention and the protection it deserves, and to be able to have that story told in a National Geographic feature documentary through the story of the Florida Panther is going to reach a whole new level of audiences. And I'm so excited to see what kind of energy it can bring to this broader movement.
Yeah, absolutely. And the book, so we're recording this on Monday, May 1st. And if I remember from the email correctly, the book drops tomorrow, right?
Yes. Yep.
How excited is that? How exciting is that? How excited are you?
It's amazing. I can't wait for people to connect with this story, because this story belongs to all Floridians, and it belongs to anyone who's ever been to or knows someone who comes to the state of Florida. This is the fabric that holds it all together, and the Panther is weaving that thread. That the fabric, the Panther is showing us what we need to do to save the land, not just for panthers, but for balance and for ourselves. And I think there's enough intrigue and mystique about the Panther that it's going to bring new people into this story. And they might not know that the Panther is a tawny colored animal that's not a black panther. And They might not know that it needs 200 square miles of habitat. And they might not know that saving the land for the Panther is going to help save the Everglades and the water supply for millions of Floridians. But if people connect with the story and gather even one or two of those bits of information that help inform their relationship to the place that they live or the place that they're visiting, then that Panther is serving a great cause for all of us. So, the hope goes on that people will identify with this story and they'll share the story, because that's what it's going to take. Because for every 1,000 people we educate, 1,000 new people are moving to Florida the next day.
Oh, man.
And so
that's a heck of a perspective.
Yeah, we have a tremendous opportunity, like staying optimistic about it. We have a huge opportunity to educate and inspire through storytelling. And my first choice would be for everybody to go experience these places firsthand the way I have. Logistically, we don't have time for that. We have to inspire people to connect with these places on their own adventures, but also connect to them with their hearts and minds through stories. And we need to link arms, all the storytellers, all the people who care about these places, to raise our voices so that animals like the Panther, places like the Everglades, will continue to have voices themselves.
Absolutely. There was one thing that I wanted to go back to that you talked about that I just wanted to touch on really quick. You mentioned that you've done, if I remember correctly, it was 2 different excursions through the corridor to show that there is this connected land. Can you tell me a little bit more about what it was like and how often you felt like you were truly in the wilderness, and how often you were in the wilderness, but also there were cars driving by and stuff like that? What was that like?
It was an awesome experience that really changed my view of Florida. Because, like most people living on the coast, coming to visit, you see the state from the outside looking in. and you might not even know it has this wild interior. And by slowing down and walking and paddling throughout the entire corridor, I got to really see the state from the inside out. And got so many points of inspiration, met so many amazing people. And this is a corridor of opportunity. Like we, in 2012, camped on and hiked across and camped on 30 different cattle ranches, all ranches that welcomed us to tell their story because they see conservation as one of the ways to help save their livelihood and their future as well. It was, as wild and remote as you could be, the edges were never too far away. I mean, even in the beginning of the first expedition, we're out in the middle of Everglades National Park. It's a true wilderness area. We've been paddling and then push-pulling our kayaks upstream through the Shark River Slough, through the Sawgrass. But you're still in the flyway for the Miami airport, which is only 60 miles away. So you're getting all these signs of humanity that are always there. Other times it was a lot closer. We did an expedition a few years later. We've done some shorter expeditions. Joe and Mallory and I, the original trekkers from the big expeditions in 2012 and 2015, revisited some of the bottlenecks and some of the pinch points in the corridor. There was an expedition we did from the headwaters of the Everglades across Interstate 4 to the Green Swamp, and the film about it was called The Last Green Thread. During that week-long expedition, we went through some bottlenecks where the corridor squeezed down to only a quarter mile wide. And at one point, I'm knee-deep in a swamp next to giant cypress trees, listening and trying to figure out which way Joe or Mallory went. And I hear this kind of squawking of a voice coming, and I sit still and I listen closer. And it's the PA system at a Lowe's home improvement that's saying that outside lawn and garden extension 6 or something like that.
Right.
And it is so out of context because I had just slept in a hammock hanging over a swamp near this wildlife filled transitional forest, and you can think you're deep in the heart of a huge national park, but the edges are right there. There's another moment a couple of days later. We're paddling up Reedy Creek, which is in the headwaters of the Everglades, and having this moment where the filmmakers and I are photographing and filming a limpkin, which is feeding on some snails at the knees of these cypress trees, and there's a barred owl looking down from a live oak branch up above, and it's just this wild natural experience. And if you listen close, you hear some noises on the edges, and if you look at your map, you realize Disney's Animal Kingdom is like a quarter mile away from the creek. And so there are really times where these two Floridas are like literally touching each other, but somehow coexisting. And I think that's where also a lot of the hope comes from, because those are the tightest and narrowest of the bottlenecks, and we can't have that everywhere. But if we can protect the big, miles wide, large connected green spaces in most areas, having these more narrow corridors can still allow the bear or the panther or the bobcat or the deer to move through every generation as needed to share those genetic material and keep the populations healthy. So it's a miracle that we still have this chance in Florida, but it's really cool to see that if we give nature space, the way it can come back.
Absolutely. That's very cool. When you told me that story, it made me think of when I was in the Boy Scouts growing up. I grew up in the Harrisburg, Pennsylvania area. So state capital, but also a lot of green around it. And we did a week-long trip where we hiked and canoed down the Susquehanna River. And it was literally the same thing. One night we would sleep on an island, and we hadn't seen or heard people other than our troop all day. And the next night we slept on a different island on the Susquehanna, and the golden arches were right on the other side of the water, shining on us all night. And yeah, and I really connected with like how like nature is here and people are here, and it's much more interconnected than people realize until you've done something like that, I think. I can't imagine doing that all the way like through the Florida Wildlife Corridor. That's incredible. That's really cool.
How many Boy Scouts shuffled out at night for a Big Mac?
I don't think anyone was able to get on because we stayed. Let's just say we stayed on the islands for a reason. No one was allowed to steal a boat.
There you go.
I think some of the leaders might have, though, to be honest with you.
No, it does put it in perspective how connected and how proximal all of this is. Yeah. So, do you live in Pennsylvania now?
I do, yeah.
So it'd be really good for the Florida panther and really good for nature in Pennsylvania if some of our panthers found their way up there. Because the number of people who die on the roads with collisions with deer and the people who get sick from tick-borne disease, that would all be greatly improved if we had the natural predator back on the landscape.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I grew up in an area where the first day of hunting season is a school holiday because they want you to go out and hunt and encourage people to hunt deer because it's so bad. Almost every car that I have had has eventually met a deer, which breaks my heart. I just got a new car and I'm like, as I'm driving, I'm so scared because they are literally, it's just part of life in Pennsylvania. You just learn to adapt to the fact that someday something's going to happen and some friend's not going to show up or you're not going to show up or something because you hit a deer. Hopefully not too badly, but it's crazy. I would yes, please. If you could box up some panthers and send them up to me, I'd really appreciate it.
We'll need some help from our friends at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and a whole lot of support from rural Pennsylvania to accept those animals on the landscape. But that's one of my missions now. We're going to have the film, we're going to have the book, we're going to have the ability to tell this story. Within the state of Florida, I want people to stop thinking of this as the South Florida panther, an animal that lives on life support down in the Everglades, and start thinking of it as the Florida panther, an animal that deserves and belongs in a home that extends statewide. And those boundaries don't stop at the Georgia-Florida line or the Alabama-Florida line. There's a huge opportunity to restore, recover, and reconnect wildlife corridors throughout this country. In the Appalachian Mountains, all the way up the Eastern Seaboard, the Atlantic Coastal Plain, all the way up into Maine. There's still a remnant connected landscape throughout the eastern United States. And I think an animal like the Florida panther could bring people into the conversation of what it could look like to save that national wildlife corridor and all the benefits that could bring, including maybe your new car will stay shiny and new much longer this time.
Right. Yeah. No. And that would be nice. You upgrade to the, I upgraded to a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. I do so much traveling for drumming. I can't go full electric yet, but, doing my part, doing what I can. And I would like it to last because it wasn't the cheapest decision,
Yeah. Well, good for you investing in the planet, right?
Yeah. That's the goal. Is there anything else that you want to say about this project or this story or anything else?
Gosh, well, I thank my wife, Susie, and my children for giving me the space and the time to chase this story, because for the past 6 to 7 years, I've been in the field a lot.
I bet.
And I'm really, in a lot of ways, I've been doing it for them because they're the ones who are going to inherit our good or bad decisions right now. What we decide to do for protecting nature is going to determine what Florida, what this country, what this world is going to look like 10, 20, 30 years from now, and we don't have time to wait. So that's the other place the hope comes from. It's the balance of hope that we can do this and motivation that we must do this, because there's way too much at stake if we don't.
Yeah, makes sense. It's time now, don't you know? We've come to the end of the show, but there's one tale left to go. You're gonna laugh and say, oh no. It's time for the Rossifari poop story.
Poop. I mean, the thing is, when you spend that much time in the field, poop's just part of life, so you don't really even think about it differently. It's not like, it's just like, you dig the hole of the machete, you do your business, you cover it back over. Sometimes when you're...
That's not an interesting story to you, but that's an interesting story to my audience. I guarantee you people who have been listening to this are not sitting there thinking about, oh my gosh, when you're out in the field, you can't slip into a local hotel and drop a toozy. So,
Yep. No, it's just like humanity has been doing it for hundreds of thousands of years. Drop it and move on. But here, these days you have to be a little more careful to make sure not to leave any impact on the environment when you do. But, scat's a big part of life too. When you're looking for bears and panthers, you look for tracks, you look for scat, you learn to know the difference between a bear and a coyote and a panther to understand who's been walking those trails before you.
Yeah. Yeah. Very cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it. And I'm really looking forward to the film hitting Disney Plus. And I'll be checking out the book.
Yeah. Thanks for spreading the word on that. I mean, maybe you'll do this in your text, but what I want to ask listeners to do is to help spread this story. If you go to pathofthepanther.com, we have an impact campaign, ways you can take action and add your voice to support the Panther, learn about upcoming film screenings and book signings, because this is a huge moment that my whole team and I have been working towards for a very long time, to be able to have this story in a form that we can truly share it with the world. And it's going to take all of us to keep spreading the word and showing that this is an example that we can achieve in Florida and lots of other places.
Awesome. I will definitely promote that on the socials and on the podcast. And I will tell you that my listener base is very motivated. They like to share things. They like to help with that kind of thing. So y'all listening, when you put this podcast away, go check out the website, hit your social media, share this message. It is important. It is nice local conservation. And it's something that, I think a lot of people, when you talk about conservation, you don't always get to see a lot of impact right away, because there's a lot of scary stuff out there. But this is an incredible positive story, and sharing those is always a good thing.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much.
All right, so there you have it. If you have Hulu or if you have Disney Plus, you need to go right now and check out Path of the Panther. Some of the images that you will see are absolutely incredible. And I'm just so appreciative of Carlton for making such an incredible project, and for, spearheading the Florida Wildlife Corridor, which is something that I've been fascinated by for quite a while now. So go check that out. Go hit up pathofthepanther.com. And I'm excited to keep bringing these cool stories of Nat Geo Explorers and the awesome work that they're doing to y'all amongst all of our fun little zoo stuff. So I'd like to say thank you to my Red Panda level patrons, Laura Shank, Kristen Dickey, and Stephen Williamson. And again, remind y'all that you too can support the pod for as little as $3 a month by going to patreon.com/Rossifari. And remember, y'all, the word credits backwards is Steiderk.
The Rossifari podcast is produced, hosted, and engineered by John Rossi. Editing and fact-checking by John and Dr. Zoe Rossi. Our theme song is Sevens by Nathan Burke, performed by Nathan and John. Interrupting John theme and additional voices by Taylor Isaac Gray. You can reach John directly on Instagram and Facebook at Rossifari or by email at rossifaripod@gmail.com. Rossifari is part of the Daydreamer Media Network. Now, stop listening to me and go visit a zoo.